Hi, Cameron.
Hi.
How are you doing?
Good. How are you?
Good. So I had someone from TMCC, Jennifer, sign up. I was just waiting to see if she was going to hop on.
Okie dokie. And then, did you see my chat about having to leave at 11 o'clock each day?
Sure. Yeah,
Oh,
that's no problem.
I think I
Uh,
sent you an email at some point, but
yeah, I was kind of thinking the discussions will probably only go until about 11. I just gave us until 11:30 and just in case.
okay.
Um, oh, okay, yeah. They are. I'm gonna go ahead and just send her the link because I got a notification from somebody else that they're not able to log in. Perfect.
I love your photo, Jen. Oh my gosh, super cute.
Hello.
Thank you. Hi.
Good morning. How are you today, Jennifer?
I'm doing well. How are you?
Good. Thank
Good.
you for joining us.
Absolutely. Thank you. This looks like it's going to be a really cool conversations to have on Fridays. I love it.
Awesome. So glad you're going to join us for the rest of the series. It should be
Yeah.
fun. Hi, Lorley. Can you hear us?
I can, yes. Can you hear me?
Yes. Well, hello. Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining me for this roundtable series. So, this is our second week. We're going to chat a little bit about consent today. And before we get started, I thought it would be nice if we just took an opportunity to try to connect with each other as best as we can. With all of these virtual meetings and webinars, I found I like to do that through a collective breath. So if you guys are comfortable, feel free to just kind of start to bring your awareness to where you are right now. However you're coming into this morning is welcome and accepted. Maybe it's been hectic. I know mine has. Maybe it's been a little calm. So let's just breathe to settle and get into the same space. So I like to do my breathing with my eyes closed. Feel free to do whatever feels natural and comfortable. I invite you to just focus on where you're at. If you're sitting down, what chair is supporting you? Where are your feet at? Just take maybe 2 or 3 breaths. One more. And if you feel ready. Okay. So today, talking about consent, I'd love to hear from all of you first. So when you think about consent, what does that mean for you?
Just like someone giving their permission to, I mean, consent can be for a plethora of things, but just like if you're gonna do something with someone or for someone or whatever, just making sure that they're okay with what you're planning on doing.
Yeah, I agree, Cameron. And I think that it's being present in the moment and acknowledging like, this is something that I want. And like you said, it's for a plethora of things, right? But just in general, just being present and being able to say, okay, this is what I want and I am okay with X, Y, and Z, whatever's happening in the moment.
I think it could be verbal and nonverbal. Prefer verbal, but it can definitely be nonverbal by your actions and facial expressions, body language, things like that.
Yeah, I agree with all of that. In addition to those, for me, I think consent is something that's continuous. And it's something that we have the power to choose if we don't want anything anymore. So absolutely. And so then when we think about not just consent, but then using that specific phrasing, enthusiastic consent, is that something you've heard of before? Okay, so kind of mixed. Perfect. Lorelei, I know you have heard of it before. So with enthusiastic consent, Cameron, Jennifer, since this is a new phrase to you, I'd love to hear what does come to your mind when you hear enthusiastic paired with that.
To me, it just means like there's no question. Like this is what I want. I'm very short, like a short answer. That's what comes to mind for me.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I was going to say something similar. Just more of like an excitement to say yes and not having like a pressure to say yes.
Right. Yeah. And so excitement to say yes. I really like that phrase. What would that look like for you guys specifically? What kind of signs might you want to be looking for in yourself and then maybe a partner?
Are they responding enthusiastically with what you both are doing at the time? Or are they backing away? Are they pushing you away? What are they, what emotions are they showing?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah, I would agree. And also, I mean, I think body language is a huge thing. And then what Jen said earlier, just being present. Like you're there, you're present, you are conscious and aware of what's going on, and you're actively engaging in or participating in whatever's going on. And it's like you're making it very clear that like
Mm-hmm.
this is the decision I'm making and I'm okay with this.
Yeah, thank you. I think being clear is definitely crucial and needed to have enthusiastic consent. So, what about one model that I like to use when thinking about consent is the Fries model? Is that something that you guys are familiar with?
What was that?
The Fries model.
Mm.
Okay, so Planned Parenthood shares this, and I think it's a really easy and transparent way to understand how do we give, receive, and understand what enthusiastic consent is. So if we think of French fries, one of my favorite foods, fries, F, that would stand for freely given. So Cameron's brought this up a little bit. You both have to be present. You have to be consciously aware. So that means that you can't be under the influence or you can't be unconscious, right? To freely give consent, we need to be able to feel like there's no pressure. We don't want to be coerced into anything. Does anybody have anything to add when thinking about consent being freely given?
Well, I think you need to think about the state you're in. I mean, the actual like Nevada or Minnesota, because states are starting to pass that you can freely give consent when you're under the influence.
Yeah, so for the sake of this conversation, let's think of Nevada, because you cannot consent if you are under the influence in the state of Nevada, and that's imperative to know. So that's for both parties, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's a good point, Lauralee, is everything we're getting to talk about today is going to look different in other areas. So other locations might not have the same standards. But thinking about this model, this could be your personal standard for how you want to go forward with relationships in the future. So with the fries, so we have freely given, and then the next would be R, and that stands for reversible. And when we think about engaging in any kind of activity, whether it's sexual or maybe just intimate, at any point you have the right to stop. You have the right to change or switch gears or do something differently. So that is something that you always have the power to do. Is that new information to you guys? Do you feel like you've always felt you were in control of reversing your consent once it's been given?
For me, yes. I think one of the things is that this is good information for our students, because I feel like some of our students, especially younger populations, because I mean, Jen has contact with a lot of high school students, and then understanding for them to understand this, I think it kind of comes with maybe age, maturity, experience, like knowledge of information that people are giving to us, or that we can give to younger populations.
Yeah.
Yeah, Cam. And I think one of the things that um, high school students and just in general that these students and people want information on too is how do I guess their problem is how do I deal with the other person's reaction to me saying no when I had said yes. So now I may have someone who respects it or is angry or now is going to make me do something I don't want to. Right. So their fear is not saying no, but more so how are they going to react to what I'm about to say. And now I have to put myself in a situation where it's like fight or flight, you know?
Totally. And that's a really good point, Jennifer, because we never know how somebody else may respond, especially when you're in that moment where maybe you have that heightened arousal or just overall emotions. It could be really challenging to bring that up. So we'll pause on the fries model because I think that's a really good point. I'd like to talk about that a little bit more. What are your guys' ideas for how to avoid situations like that? How do you ensure that maybe the reaction would be something a little bit more manageable? And if you don't have any ideas, that's okay too.
I would say just the level of trust within the person. So, I mean, if you know the person, obviously stuff happens all the time with people that you know that are super close to you. But I think having a level of trust, knowing the person a little bit longer, maybe if you don't know the person very well, you don't know what to expect from them. And then I think maybe just having that communication outright before, like, we're gonna just having that open communication, like, I'm agreeing to this, but if at any point I decide that I don't want to do it, is that something that you're okay with? Like having that discussion beforehand. So then there's kind of like this, you know, I don't even know what, like the prepatus or whatever, however you say that word, that like they're prepared that like, I might not be 100% with this all the time. I think if you don't have that pre-conversation, just like making sure that you, and that's hard because it's like if you're kind of in the moment and like you say no and they don't react the way that you wanted them to, like how do you get yourself out of that situation safely? So that's a completely other conversation of, you know, the farther you are into intimacy or whatever, it could be more risky saying no. And so
Yeah.
That one's hard because you can only control what you feel and what you say, right? You can't control the other person's reaction. So like Cam said, that's hard. That's, you don't know, but one of the things, you know, that I have seen in the past too from other presentations is kind of like not just saying no, but saying, you don't have to explain yourself, obviously. All this should take is no, right? But kind of just going a little further, like, no, I'm very uncomfortable. I thought that I could go through with this, but I'm really uncomfortable, or stuff like that. Just kind of digging deeper and letting the other person know this is how it's making me feel, instead of just like outright no. That's all it should take, obviously, but sometimes, you know, if the other person is getting upset or doesn't understand, maybe just kind of talking a little bit more of your feelings and how you feel in the moment.
Totally. So what you both said, I think, flows very nicely into what I stands for, which is informed, or I like to call it more so fully informed. So let's think of your consenting, typically healthy relationship between two adults, okay? Prior to any intimacy, absolutely, Cameron, I'm right there with you. A conversation might be worthwhile to have of what your limits are, what your expectations are, what your boundaries look like. And then, yeah, what does make you feel comfortable and what doesn't make you feel comfortable? And then how do we address a situation if one of us isn't feeling it? So being fully informed involves that communication on both ends before any intimate or sexual acts begin. So ideally, it's a person that, like Cameron said, you trust and you can have that conversation with. In addition to being fully informed, we have to think about you know, having the full story. So what exactly is it that I'm consenting to? Are we going to have sex using protection or not using protection? If you had agreed in the beginning that you would like to use protection and then it wasn't utilized during the act, then there wasn't full consent during your sexual activities. So I think definitely having some kind of communication, if possible, beforehand is a great skill to have in order to be on the same page. Jennifer, I do really like saying I'm uncomfortable. And, you know, I think both Cameron and Lauralee have brought up there might be more ways than one to let your partner know that if you aren't able to verbalize it. Because sometimes in the moment, if you're truly uncomfortable, it can be hard to say that, right? So looking out for any verbal or any physical cues or facial expressions, that's one way for individuals to stay informed. And in a little bit, I'm going to share a video with you all, which I think shows some really good examples of the different ways to identify if consent is not quite there yet. There's a little bit of hesitation or apprehension because we're allowed to have that. We're allowed to be unsure. But if we're unsure, what do you think that means? Probably means that if I'm unsure if I want to do something, I don't think I would be consenting to that. So yes, if I just said no, that should be enough. The title of today is Yaaas Means Yes. I don't know if you guys like to say yes, but I love that because it's super enthusiastic. Yes, I even have my own little yes dance to go with it. Yeah, a little sass. So, Yaaas Means Yes is a different thought process and mental state to be at, as opposed to some previous campaigns like no means no. And no means no is still 100% accurate. If somebody says no, that does mean no. However, if we keep using that phrasing, there can be that miscommunication that in the absence of no, suddenly something is consensual. Well, they didn't say no, so it must have meant yes. Our conversation today is to try to challenge that thought and look for the presence of an enthusiastic yes as opposed to the absence of a no. Do any of you guys have thoughts on that?
I I worry about it with returning older students that are returning to school, that are dating, that, the generations that were raised with no means yes, that you don't have to look for those verbal cues, that if they're not saying anything, they must want it, things like that. I worry about that with, 30, 40, 50-year-olds that, that's how it was. And boys will be boys was a big thing. And, girls have been objectified and sexualized and all of that. So for consent for the older adults, not just for the younger kids right now, but for the older adults, I don't think we're out there enough talking about what consent looks like. So that's kind of how I feel about that.
Yeah, thank you for bringing that insight. Cameron, Jennifer, do either of you guys have any thoughts on what Laura Lee shared and the yes means yes?
I 100% agree. And I think even at TMCC, we can take it a little bit farther too, because we have so many age ranges in our population. And, some of the younger generations have much more access to the internet and things on the internet and dating sites and getting themselves in the situations with people who may be older too, who have different viewpoints. So I think really, I like the take on the flip side of Yaaas means yes instead of no means no, because then you can really, it kind of takes away some of the power of like, if they're not saying anything, then that must mean that they're agreeing with it, or instead of like that kind of like boys will be boys, like they're going to do what they're going to do and you better just be okay with it. Like kind of, it's a generational belief. But I really like that you brought that up, Laura Lee, because we have to think about the spectrum of people and the continuum of age, and then what comes along with the beliefs and generations. So.
Yeah, and I agree with both of you. And I think that one thing that at least I'm seeing, I'm not sure if this was the case when we were younger, but even like in preschool, my little ones are learning, to say no if they don't want to be touched, or saying no thank you or stuff like that, to their friends. So I think like that's something different, because I did ask my parents, and nowhere in their upbringing were they taught that. It was just like, and it was also a cultural thing. You respect your elders, and if someone older says do this, do that, you better do it. So I think like at least our kids and us to a certain extent, we're growing up with this idea of choice, and like absolutely it's autonomy over your own body or whatever. So I think like what Cameron's saying, and Laura Lee, over the generations, it's been different. And we certainly grew up way different than our parents did. So it's good to see that shift in education, and also how early it's starting.
Mm-hmm. Well, and also, when we're talking about consent, Jennifer brings up good points as like, I have noticed a lot recently too, like the can I hug you or I mean, before COVID, people would ask that things like, oh, you look really upset. Is it okay if I give you a hug? Or, really just asking for that consent to even like physically touch someone and like not just coming up and like putting your hand on their shoulder or doing any of those things that might be unwanted physical contact. And I think the education has been getting a lot better as far as teaching kids that they can say no, teaching kids more appropriate boundaries with, just because someone's older than you doesn't mean you have to listen to them and do everything that they want you to do. And
Mhm.
we're seeing that more in school settings, like Jen brought up. We're seeing it in more of like public settings too, where you're teaching your kids like the whole stranger danger thing has always been around, but more of like having that autonomy to like make your decision, even if you're 5 or 6.
Right. Yeah, thank you so much for bringing that up because, yeah, consent is way more than just for sexual situations. We all have consent 24/7 of how we want to be treated and touched and interacted with. So I've also, I've really appreciated that that's kind of been more of a social shift in general that people are recognizing, at least for hugs, being like, well, I'm a hugger isn't, that doesn't mean that you get to touch me. Or let's think about if somebody is pregnant. You can't just go up and grab their belly because you're excited about it, right? They should be absolutely the ones to give permission or start that interaction.
Well, and even like hair, like a lot of African American people, like, can I touch your hair? Or people just touch your hair. Like, I've never felt this kind of hair before. And like, I've seen a huge shift in that too, like understanding and respecting like different cultural differences and like different body types and hair types, and not like, just I think we're making huge strides, but there's still work to be done.
Yes. Yeah. It is. And that's a great point too. It's for every part of your body. Absolutely. So that brings us to E in our Fry's model, which would be the enthusiastic. We've talked a lot about that already, but it's really, you get to do what you want to do, not what's expected of you or not what somebody else wants to do. It's what you want. So having that enthusiasm and, like I said, the little yes, like, oh, I'm excited for this. That's the feeling and emotion that we want to be evoked before we're engaging in any kind of contact with somebody, whether it's the platonic hug from a friend or a coworker, that should still make you feel good. That's what we're looking for. And then lastly, the S stands for specific. And this one is, I think, the one that I like to touch on the most because it kind of goes along with the fully informed. But for specific, it's really, sex doesn't just happen. There's usually a few stages before that. Maybe it's kissing, maybe it's holding hands, maybe it's a little bit of touching, but every single stage of intimacy needs to have that consent. So you can absolutely be with a partner and for a while say, I'm only okay with going to, this stage in our relationship for right now. Because just because you said yes to one thing, like maybe making out or some foreplay, that doesn't necessarily mean that you're saying yes to having sex with somebody. So with our Fry's model, I found a quote from Advocates for Youth that I think really kind of ties it all together. So I'll read this now. Consent isn't a question, it is a state. If instead of lovers, the two of you were synchronized swimmers, consent would be the water. It's not enough to just jump in, get wet, and climb out. If you want to swim, you have to be in the water continuously. And if you want to have sex, you have to continuously be in a state of enthusiastic consent with your partner. Okay, so hearing what we've chatted about so far, before we show this quick video, any last thoughts on the phrase model or Yaaas Means Yes? Okay, so give me one moment. I'm going to stop my video so I could share my screen. Sorry, y'all, I was muted. I just want to make sure that you guys will be able to hear this. Okay.
Will you dance with me?
I'd love to.
Can I take off your shirt? Yes, you may.
May I walk you home?
That's very kind of you, but I like to go by myself.
Okay. Would you like to see a motion picture with me?
Yes, I could even go tonight. So how far do you want to go?
I'd like to keep my clothes on.
Hey, do you want to spend the night? Well, that's okay. You don't really seem into it. I think we should wait. Can I kiss you?
I'd like that.
Do you want to keep going?
Not now.
It's okay. I just want you to be comfortable.
Want to make out?
Sorry, I'm too tired. Maybe another time.
Sounds good.
Are you ready?
Yes.
Okay, so that was the quick little video. What did you think about that?
I think that it was really cool showing over the time. You know, we talked about generational differences, and I thought it was really cool seeing, you know, the different responses, and it would be so cool if that's how it would happen each time. You know, it's just unproblematic, just, you know, respectful and stuff like that. So but what we were talking about earlier, you know, learning this early on is really important. I mean, even for my daughter, you know, sometimes I'm like, hey, give me a hug. She's like, I really don't want to today, you know, and it's not, my reaction could be like, why? I'm your mom, you know, instead of it being like, okay, that's okay, I'm here if you need me, or something like that, you know. So I think like learning those things early on, I wish I would have at an early age, you know, learn to speak up for myself and really voice what I actually was feeling.
Yeah, that word respect always sticks with me when people use it in relation to consent. There's a couple of things you said that I would love to touch on. First, with that video, you know, one thing that we were talking about is, you know, what if you can't say no? So I think one of my favorite parts of that video was when the one gal was asking the other, do you want to stay the night? And then she goes, well, and then there's just that moment, you know, that moment of hesitation, that moment of uncertainty. And thankfully, yeah, her partner was respectful, identified that, okay, you're not enthusiastic about it. You know, this isn't something you really want to do. So let's not do it. And I absolutely agree. I wish every single situation happened like this. We know that it doesn't always happen. So with this education, what people can know is if on their end, if they're a little bit cognizant of what they have as expectations and needs for consent to be met, then hopefully, if they ever find themselves in a situation where somebody didn't respect that, it might be a little bit more understandable that, that's nothing that they did wrong. That's not their fault. That is somebody else committing a crime. That is somebody else disrespecting consent and a person's body, right?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. And I think that that's why it's very important to educate both parties. We always think about educate, and this is just the way it's always been, educating women about consent, right? But then it's like, okay, men, like, let's learn, and equally when we're raising our children, male or female, we're going to learn about consent, about learning to ask for it, and freely giving it, right? So it's just like, and respecting the other person's responses. So I think that's also very important. And this is why I love educational conversations like this, because it does bring awareness to the fact that everyone should be educated about all of these topics, and because they're relevant to all of us.
Yeah. Thank you so much for saying that. I can 100% agree. I think this information is helpful for anybody. And then just to touch on what you had said before about those interactions with your daughter, for me, that brings to mind, again, no matter what your relationship is with the person, you are still entitled and have the right to consent to those interactions. So just because it's a parent, just because it's a person you're already in a relationship to, that doesn't automatically give consent, right? We're thinking back to like the specific, that's for every interaction. So for me, I don't mind sharing a little bit about my personal life. I'm married, and my husband and I, every day, truly, I wake up and say, hey, can I give you a kiss? When I'm feeling a little lovey-dovey, that doesn't mean he is. Just because we're married, that doesn't mean that I always have the right to go up and touch him or show my affection. I need to check in with my partner, and I'm really grateful and thankful that he does the same. So that implied consent, that's not a thing. That's why we talk about the yes means yes. It has to be there every time.
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you for bringing that up, because I have conversations with married women, thinking like, and maybe it's a cultural thing, I'm not sure, but they're like, well, he's my husband, I have to. Right. And it's kind of like, no, you don't. You can voice the fact that you're not comfortable, you don't want to do whatever it was. So thank you for bringing that up, because I think that's a big misconception too, that, like you said, no matter the relationship, you have the right to consent to whatever it is that they're asking you to do, for sure.
Yeah, totally.
And again, that's generational because, back in my day, and I'm aging myself, when you got married, your parents, your moms would tell you, you're obliged. It's part of being married, and it doesn't matter if you want to or not. So I was kind of the rebel because I always fought back against that. I'm like, no, that's not okay. And my mom and I would go round and round and round. It's like, I'm sorry, but I have a say in this too. But it wasn't taught to us back then that way. Consent really wasn't even talked about back then in the 70s and 80s.
So, Lauralee, I'm interested, when did you start noticing that consent was coming up more in conversations, whether that was in the family or a little bit more publicly?
It really wasn't ever talked about in my family. When I talked about it, it started really becoming a thing in the early 2000s is when I started really hearing about consent. And when I would bring it up, I was, like I said, I was the black sheep of the family. And wasn't really supported in it. And I was this extreme feminist. And, it's a lot of people in the traditional sense of marriage is like, you're obligated. This is your wifely duty is what they called it. And I'm like, hell no. I don't think it works that way at all. And so then I was being extreme. But I didn't really hear consent coming to the forefront until probably the early 2000s is when I started hearing about it. Probably, see, Ethan was born in 2002, so probably right around 2002, 2000, right around there.
Yeah, that's so interesting. And I'm very thankful to be growing up in this age where I do think it's being talked about a little bit more. Jennifer, I absolutely agree. This is not a woman's responsibility to talk about. Consent is not gender specific. This should be a conversation that involves everybody, all ages, all generations, all cultures, because we've had a lot of discussion about how consent is interpreted differently through cultures too. And so I think that that's really important to bring awareness to. And then the last thing that I wanted to mention is, when we think about when we're verbalizing what is okay and what's not okay, I just want everyone to know that you do not have to offer an explanation. And again, you don't even have to verbally say no. If you are showing those other signs, like we kind of saw in the video, just like the hesitation or like the body language of just kind of like moving away, not really wanting to be touched or, looking away. All of those are indications that you're not into something. So you never have to tell somebody, provide any further details than you're able to or you're wanting to. Okay, so to kind of conclude today, prior to coming into this conversation and your knowledge of consent, what has changed now? Do you have any different beliefs or expectations or hopes for your future interactions with individuals?
I think the hope I have is that we continue to get the word out to everybody about consent, especially enthusiastic consent. We're doing a good job with the young people. I really think we're really doing a good job with that. I think we're not doing as good of a job with the older people, the older generations. My generation, my friends still, I'm the go-to person when one of their friends gets assaulted, and I hear it every time. I felt obligated. They bought me dinner. We went out dancing. We were drinking. And I think getting the word out to both genders and everybody, non-binary, everybody, get the word out about consent and what enthusiastic consent is, and really start trying to market it to the older generations, so they can understand. Because Cameron brought up a good point. The older generation of males seem to be dating the younger generation of females. And the younger generation of females might understand what consent is, but the older generation might not. Mm-hmm. So then you're at an impasse there, and I could see a tendency towards violence and or assault.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I think also, with that approach of reaching out and sharing this education with those who are in older generations, it'll have a trickle down effect. If they have any younger siblings, or, if they're a mentor, a teacher, or a coach, or, if they have any children of their own, then absolutely, if they have a better understanding and awareness of what consent is, what their boundaries are, I could see that would benefit everybody.
Mm-hmm.
Jennifer, do you have any last thoughts?
No, I think this was really informative. I think the piece that I really liked learning about was the enthusiastic consent, right? So, but like Lauralee said, we continue to be advocates and getting the word out there and just empowering people to feel comfortable enough to voice, their wishes and whatever they want. And like she said, I think because even my parents now, to this point, they won't even talk about sex in general. They grew up that way, right? So it's just getting them comfortable, like she said, the older generation, letting them know you can still learn this and it's still okay, and even more so, some of, like, my parents one time were like, oh, we didn't want to have Sunday dinner. Then say that, I don't want anyone at my house this week. That's okay. You want to be
Yes.
left alone, say so. We are not going to be angry or upset, so just kind of voicing their wishes. But like she said, getting the word out there to not just the younger generation, but just everyone, because it's part of all of our lives, and more so after COVID. We have it's just different now. So where we were huggers, maybe now we are not, because we are paranoid, or because it gives us anxiety, or whatever the case may be, right? So more so now in a post-COVID world, well, almost, hopefully, that's more at the forefront now. Consent is more important, more than ever, for sure.
Yeah, that's such a good point. There are so many different reasons and situations of where you have the right to have consent respected. Um, I really like that example of coming over for dinner. Just social consent too, absolutely. There are times that you don't feel up to doing anything, and it's okay to communicate that with friends, family members, whoever. Absolutely. And then also, yeah, just because maybe a friend of yours, you guys used to hug each other every time you saw each other before COVID, now they might not feel that way. So I'm so glad you brought that up, because that really highlights that consent is fluid and it's ever changing. And one day you might like this, one day you might not like that, and that's absolutely okay. All right. So I think that's all that I had to share. I want to thank you again for being here. And Jennifer, it looked like you had one more thing to say.
I was just going to say thank you. It was really a great presentation. Thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
Glenn, this was good.
Thanks so much. Well, if you would like to join next Friday, we're going to talk about tech safety. So I look forward to seeing you then.
We'll see you next Friday. Thank you.
Yep. See you then.
Great.
Bye.
Bye, everyone.